Hey, it's Joey, and this is Your Black Politics. This interview is with Justin Guest. He's the author of Majority Minority, and he's on the Breaking Point with Crystal Ball and Carl Sager. It's a book about the changing demographics in the country and how that's going to be or should be affecting the politics. Pay particular attention to what they say when they say assimilate in this country and what that means and its relation to whiteness. Let's listen.
First of all, you've done a lot of research on demographic shifts in this country, in countries around the world, how that's worked out for political systems, both in ways good and bad. And it's given you some particular insight into the trouble that Democrats are having with Latinos right now. So just break a little bit of that down for us.
Sure. Well, the United States has been trending in the direction that we see of other majority-minority states around the world, where you see a lot of minority groups growing in number. You often see the racialization of politics. And we are beginning to see the U.S. trending in that direction over the last 2 decades, where what racial or ethnic identity you are often is predicting or more predicting of your political choices. But that's starting to change in an interesting way right now, because recently there have been a number of polls that are showing that Latinos are actually beginning to marginally move closer towards the Republican Party, whereas before they were almost a 2/3, 1/3 split, a 2-to-1 split towards Democrats. And that was something that was true for other minority groups and remains true, in some cases even more extreme. But Latinos are moving closer and closer towards a more even split to the Republican Party in a way that we haven't seen really since George W. Bush in 2004.
So let's track it then in terms of history, and that's what you write about in the book. How does that track with recent arrivals to the United States in the 1900s? How long does that transition away from ethnic voting bloc to kind of a total assimilation into normal American politics take?
Well, in some cases, it never really goes away.
Okay.
You know, there's a lot of times parties make a bond with a particular minority group or other identity group, and that bond lasts a very long time. You know, we see that today with a lot of Cuban Americans in the Republican Party, and that's just true in general. So there's no real sort of broad rule necessarily, but certainly when a minority group, when an immigrant group begins to vote not as that identity group, not as an Irish person or an Italian person or a Catholic person, but just, you know, as a sort of everyday American, or finds another form of identity, whether it's a white racial identity or perhaps a professional identity, you know, as an attorney or as a union member, that's when you really start to see what you might call assimilation, because they have dropped what had made them distinct and different before and have taken on a different identity.
I think this is a good point to interject right here. So you see by now we get the gist, we get the premise. Assimilation in and of itself isn't bad. Immigrants come into any country. They come in at first identifying and voting by their identity. Then as they become more and more part of the country, their votes more reflect the ideals of the country and they buy in. The question here is not that assimilation is bad or suspicion of assimilation. The question is, what are Latinos, Hispanics assimilating into? Because it's not the ideals of the country. And furthermore, why can't black people assimilate in America after hundreds of years? Let's listen.
So many people think it's that Latinos are looking differently at U.S. political parties. But what I would argue is that actually Latinos are looking differently at themselves. They see themselves through a different prism, not necessarily, and by the way, we shouldn't be generalizing across all Latinos, right?
Yes, yeah.
But those who are shifting their votes in particular, we can generalize a little bit more about. We're seeing them in pockets of the country like South Texas, South Florida. You have a lot of Americans there who actually self-identify as white Hispanics. So in the census, you know, you're asked your ethnicity, whether you're Hispanic or not Hispanic, and then you're asked your race: white, black, Asian American, Native Pacific Islander, et cetera. In this case, you have a lot of Latinos who also identify as white. And that white identity may be superseding their sense of Latino solidarity. In many cases, like the parts of South Texas, the borderlands of the country, many of those are people of Mexican origin who never actually necessarily migrate to the United States. The old saying there is, I didn't cross the border crossed me, right? So they're historic Tejanos who have actually always lived in that part of Texas, back when it was actually part of Mexico. Now, that's not the majority group, but there is a sense that they are different because the many generations that they've been in the United States from the immigrants who are recently arriving from Latin America and elsewhere.
Yeah, so how does that trend then for our politics moving forward? So there's a couple of ways it can go, right? Which is that increasing identity politics makes white people rediscover or reignite identity politics. That's probably not good for everybody involved. The other way that it goes is that generally, kind of how I see things, everything breaks down more along class lines as we move forward with assimilation. It's even with high levels of immigration. Which way of those trend lines do you think it'll go?
Well, I can tell you the way we want things to go is not that this is the politics of whiteness and Latinos are just assimilating into an understanding of whiteness that is somehow nationalistic and exclusive of other cultures. What we hope is that the Republican Party is actually making a concerted appeal to people of minority backgrounds and to Latinos in particular to create this change. Now, from my observations, I'm not seeing that appeal. I'm not seeing that concerted effort to bring in Latinos necessarily. What I'm seeing is more the sort of broadening of the politics of whiteness to reach the next most quote-unquote assimilable group. And I think that's problematic actually for U.S. politics going forward.
So Hispanics are assimilating, but they're assimilating into whiteness rather than to American ideals, because to them, from their interpretation, whiteness and Americanness are one and the same, and whiteness is anti-blackness. And black people, by contrast, can never assimilate, no matter what our behaviors or our work ethic is, because whiteness is defined by not being black.
So let's broaden out, because the book focuses on, okay, there have been other countries and other places where you had a group that was previously in the majority that becomes then in the minority.
Right.
How does that typically go?
Yeah, so it's a mix of conflict and coexistence, and different countries have different experiences based on a variety of things that I write about in the book quite extensively. I say 6 different countries, and they are so different. One thing they all have in common, aside from the fact that they're all islands, because they're very fragile demographies that change easily, is that they have all reached a majority-minority milestone, which is the milestone that the U.S. will reach in around 2044, 2045. And that is when the original native ethnic or religious group loses its numerical advantage to one or more minority groups. And they have all gone through this. And what we see across all these places, Crystal, is that there are pivots that they can take towards coexistence or pivots that they can take towards conflict. And you see a mix of both. But the places that pivot towards coexistence are inspiring in the way that they are redefining who they are. They are focused, they're not dropping their heritage, but they are re-understanding and broadening the understanding of the nation, right? And this goes back to what we were just chatting about with Latinos. Are we broadening the nation, or are we broadening whiteness? And I think that's the real question for the United States. Can we broaden the civic understanding of who we are as a country? And that's when we can actually follow those coexisting countries well.
So whenever you say whiteness, what does that mean? Like in terms of assimilating whiteness, right? So, because like what's wrong with a Tejano person identifying as white? I'm from Texas, so I'm very familiar with the border crossing. And I remember, seeing that at the time and being like, yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense. And like you were saying, these people see themselves as legitimately part of the Texas identity in a way that a lot of people in the Northeast and their politics don't really get. So what do you mean when you say that assimilation is itself whiteness? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a great question. So whiteness itself has changed over the course of American history.
Of course.
So early in our history, of course, whiteness referred to being Anglo-British or maybe Anglo-Dutch, Northern European Protestant, right? And that broadened actually in really important ways that brought us to our contemporary understanding of who we understand as white, right? And of course, identity is always not just about how you feel, but how other people perceive you. Identity is always not just about how you feel, but how other people perceive you. How other people perceive you. How other people perceive you. And that has also changed over the course of American history. So in many ways, actually, the evolutionary nature of whiteness, the evolutionary nature of identity is in some ways a strength of the United States, because we can actually conceive of our identity changing over time in a much more versatile way than maybe other states could. On the other hand, it's also problematic because it's so paradoxical. It creates contradictions in who we think we are. If we take a look at our country right now through a 19th century lens, right, that white Northern European Protestant lens, we're already a majority-minority country. Right. You wouldn't include Greeks or Slavs or Jews or Italians or maybe even the Irish because of their Catholicism into the old conception of whiteness. And yet that has evolved over time. Yeah. And so I think that is the flexibility of identity. But the worst part of this is that flexibility allowed the country, by bringing in new people into the understanding of whiteness, it actually led to the persistence of the subjugation of people of color. So people who were deemed too dark to be white or too different to be white. And that's what's so problematic. We want to create a civic identity that is not hinged on any kind of phenotypical appearance or any kind of race or religious background. We want to create one that is all about the civic identity of who it means to American, that America is an idea, a project that we're all contributing to.
This is Joey. This has been your Black Politics.